I'm Clara, 24 female. I lived with my mother and stepfather in the same suburban house I grew up in. I work as a freelance graphic designer, slowly building a business from my childhood bedroom, a space I'd filled with more ambition than actual furniture. This story is about the day that all came crashing down when my own mother threw my life onto the front lawn and called me a leech, telling me never to return. And it's about the 70-plus messages she sent 6 months later, begging me to come back and save her. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The air in our house had been thick for months, heavy with the kind of unspoken tension that clings to the furniture and sours the milk. My mother, Sharon, a real estate agent whose smile was as sharp as her business suits, seemed to be perpetually vibrating with stress. Every closing that fell through, every client that ghosted her, became a storm cloud that gathered directly over our roof. Her moods dictated the emotional weather of the entire household. If Mom was happy, we were allowed a brief, sunny respite. If she was stressed, a Category 5 hurricane was imminent, and we all learned to take cover. My stepfather, Mark, was her loyal barometer and amplifier. A car salesman with a practiced, easygoing charm that never quite reached his eyes, he followed my mother's emotional lead without question. If she was annoyed with me, he was 10 times more so, his voice echoing her complaints with added bass and authority. They were a perfect, self-validating system of negativity, and more often than not, I was the designated target. I was the easy variable to blame when the complexities of their own lives became too much to handle. My career, as they called it with invisible air quotes, was a constant source of friction. I was a graphic designer, and I was proud of the work I was doing. I had spent 2 years since college cultivating a small but steady list of clients, designing logos, branding packages, and marketing materials. It wasn't a 9-to-5 with a pension plan, and that, in their eyes, made it illegitimate. To them, my work was a hobby I was pursuing on their dime, despite the fact I was contributing financially. I paid them $500 a month in rent, a figure we'd agreed upon when I graduated. It wasn't market rate for a room in our town, but it wasn't nothing either. It was what I could afford while pouring most of my earnings back into my business, software subscriptions, a powerful new computer, and online courses to sharpen my skills. I bought my own groceries, did my own laundry, and kept to myself, my door usually closed as I worked late into the night, my face illuminated by the glow of my monitor. I went to great lengths to be as small and unobtrusive as possible, a ghost in my own home. Yet my presence was a constant irritant. "When are you going to look for a real job, Clara?" Sharon would ask, not looking up from her laptop at the kitchen island. "You need benefits. You need a 401k. This little art project of yours isn't sustainable." Mark would chime in, leaning against the counter. "Your mother's right. All your friends from high school have real careers. Sarah is a nurse. Jason is in management. You're clicking away in your room." The comparisons were a blade they twisted often. They saw my path not as a different choice, but as a lesser one. They saw my freelance income, which fluctuated month to month, as instability and failure. It didn't matter that my best months were already earning me more than the starting salary of most entry-level, real jobs in our area. They only saw the risk, the nonconformity. They saw a daughter who wasn't giving them the suburban success story bragging rights they so desperately craved. The only person who seemed to understand was my grandmother, Evelyn, my mom's mom, a retired librarian with a quiet strength and an endless supply of tea and wisdom. She was my lifeline. "Don't you listen to them, dear," she'd tell me during our weekly phone calls. "Building something of your own takes courage. Your mother has forgotten what that's like. She chose the well-paved road. You're clearing your own path." Grandma Evelyn lived a town over, in the small, paid-off house she'd shared with my grandfather. She was my sanctuary. Her belief in me was the armor I wore against the constant barrage of doubt at home. The tension in the house pulled taut about a month before the explosion. Mark came home one night, his face grim. He'd been banking on a huge fleet sale commission at the dealership, one he'd been boasting about for weeks. It had fallen through at the last minute. The loss was a palpable blow. Suddenly, conversations about money became whispered, frantic arguments behind their closed bedroom door. The mail, especially bills, was opened with a sigh of theatrical dread. Sharon's stress levels went from high to nuclear. She started picking fights over nothing. The way I loaded the dishwasher, the brand of coffee I bought, the fact that my car was parked too close to hers in the driveway. Each complaint was a proxy for the real problem. The financial ground was crumbling beneath their feet, and they were terrified. Instead of facing it, they turned their fear outward, and I was the most convenient place to direct it. I remember one specific phone call with my grandmother during that time. "Be careful, Clara," she warned, her voice gentle but firm. "I spoke to your mother this morning. She sounds brittle, like a glass about to shatter. The money problems with Mark are worse than she's letting on. Just keep your head down." I promised her I would. I retreated further into my room, into my work. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and tried to build my future, brick by digital brick, while the foundations of the house around me were cracking apart. I thought if I was quiet enough, if I was invisible enough, I could ride out the storm. I had no idea the storm was coming directly for me. The day it all happened started, ironically, with a sense of accomplishment. I had just finished a huge project for a new client, a complete branding guide for a local bakery. I'd sent the final invoice that morning, and the payment, a significant one, had landed in my bank account almost instantly. It was the most I'd ever made from a single project. For a few hours, I felt a quiet, glowing pride. I was proving them wrong. My little art project was becoming a real, viable business. I decided to celebrate in a small way. I went to the kitchen to make myself a nice lunch, something other than the instant noodles or sad sandwiches that were my usual fare. That was my first mistake. My second was using the good olive oil, the fancy bottle Sharon kept for special occasions. She walked in just as I was drizzling it over my salad. Her eyes, already narrowed with the day's stress, zoomed in on the bottle in my hand. "Is that my imported olive oil?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "Yeah, I just used a little," I said, trying to sound casual. "I just landed a big client. I was feeling a little celebratory." It was the wrong thing to say. My success was like gasoline on the fire of her own perceived failures. "Celebratory?" she scoffed, snatching the bottle from the counter. "You're celebrating while we're struggling to keep this house afloat? While Mark is working himself to the bone after losing that commission? What world are you living in, Clara?" "I pay rent, Mom," I said, my own voice rising to meet hers. My brief moment of pride was curdling into the familiar defensiveness. "I contribute here." $500, she laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Do you have any idea what the mortgage on this house is? What the utilities cost? What you cost? Your rent barely covers your water usage." Mark chose that exact moment to walk in from the garage, drawn by the sound of battle. He immediately took his position by her side. "What's going on?" "Clara is in here, celebrating, using my expensive ingredients, while we're trying to figure out how we're going to pay the property tax bill next month," Sharon announced, playing to her audience of one. "Of course she is," Mark said, shaking his head with a look of profound disappointment. "She doesn't have a care in the world. Why would she? She's got a free ride." "It is not a free ride," I shot back, my hands clenched into fists. "I work constantly. I am building a business. That's more than most people can say." "A business?" Mark sneered. "You play on your computer. You call that a business? At your age, you should be a homeowner yourself, not a tenant in your mother's house." The argument spiraled from there, a tornado of every resentment they'd ever held against me. I was lazy. I was ungrateful. I was directionless. I was a drain. With every word, they chipped away at the fragile confidence I'd felt just an hour before. I tried to defend myself, but it was like trying to reason with a hurricane. My words were snatched away and thrown back in my face. Then came the tipping point. Sharon's face twisted with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark. "I can't do this anymore," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I can't have you here, draining the life out of us, acting like you're entitled to everything." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're a pathetic leech. That's what you are, a leech." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. I stared at her, stunned into silence. Before I could process it, she spun around and stormed out of the kitchen. I could hear her thundering up the stairs. Mark gave me one last look of disgust and followed her. I stood frozen, the half-made salad forgotten on the counter. A moment later, I heard her bedroom door slam, then mine. A horrifying realization dawned. I ran to the front of the house and looked out the window. And there it was, my life scattered across the manicured green lawn for the whole neighborhood to see. She was throwing my things out the front door, a pile of clean laundry from the basket in my room, sweaters and jeans yanked from my drawers, the books stacked on my nightstand. It was a violation so profound, so personal, that I couldn't breathe. I watched, numb, as she came out onto the porch, her face red and blotchy. She saw me watching from the window and shouted, her voice raw with fury, "Get out! I want you out of my house. Don't ever come back." Something inside me snapped. But it wasn't anger, not yet. It was a cold, quiet clarity. The illusion of family, of love, of safety, shattered into a million pieces. There was nothing left to fight for. This wasn't a home. It was just a house owned by people who hated me. I turned away from the window. I walked calmly back through the kitchen, past my stepfather who stood there looking smugly satisfied. I didn't look at him. I went to the hook by the back door and took my car keys. I grabbed my laptop bag, which thankfully had my entire life's work inside, and my external hard drive from my desk. That was all that mattered. I walked out the front door, right past my mother who was still breathing heavily on the porch. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. With as much dignity as I could muster, I began picking up my clothes from the lawn and putting them in the back of my small sedan. The neighbors' curtains twitched. I felt their eyes on me, but I didn't care. When I had gathered what I could, I got into the driver's seat. I put the keys in the ignition and turned the car on. I took one last look at the house, at the two people on the porch who had just excised me from their lives with such brutal efficiency. Then I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, not even checking the rearview mirror. The first 10 minutes of the drive were on autopilot. I drove through familiar suburban streets with no destination in mind, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The silence in the car was a roaring vacuum, sucking all the air from my lungs. The calm, robotic state that had got me out of the house was beginning to fray, and I knew I couldn't just keep driving forever. I saw a small park with a nearly empty parking lot and pulled in, shutting off the engine. And then I broke. The sobs came from a place so deep inside me I didn't recognize them. They were ragged, ugly things torn from my chest. I slumped over the steering wheel, the humiliation and the pain washing over me in waves. A leech. My own mother had looked at me and seen a parasite. She hadn't just thrown out my clothes, she had thrown me out, discarding me like trash on the front lawn. The image was burned into my mind. After the storm of tears subsided, leaving me hollowed out and exhausted, my brain slowly started to work again. I had my car, my laptop, my phone, and a backseat full of wrinkled clothes. I had the money from the bakery project in my bank account. I wasn't completely destitute, but I was homeless. My thumb hovered over the contacts on my phone. Friends? I couldn't bear the thought of explaining this story, of seeing the pity in their eyes. There was only one person I could call. I dialed my grandmother. She answered on the second ring. "Clara, honey, is everything all right?" Her voice, so full of warmth and genuine care, was all it took to make my own voice crumble. "Grandma," I whispered, and then the whole story came tumbling out. The olive oil, the argument, the shouting, the clothes on the lawn. There was a steely silence on the other end of the line when I finished. I could almost hear her processing the information, her librarian-like mind cataloging the injustice. "Sharon did what?" she finally said, her voice stripped of its usual gentleness and replaced with cold fury. "You listen to me, Clara. You are not a leech. You are the best thing that ever happened to that woman, and she's too blind to see it. Now you stop crying. Start your car and drive to my house. You have a home here, always." Her words were a lifeboat. The relief was so immense it felt like I could finally take a full breath. "Okay, Grandma," I said, my voice thick. "I'm on my way." The drive to Grandma Evelyn's house was a journey from despair to sanctuary. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already standing on her front porch, her arms crossed, looking like a miniature general ready for battle. She didn't fuss or coddle. She just opened her arms and hugged me tightly. "Let's get your things inside," she said, her tone all business. We unloaded the car in silence. Inside, her house smelled of old books and cinnamon, the scent of safety. She led me to the guest room, a cozy space with a hand-stitched quilt on the bed. "This is your room now," she said simply, "for as long as you need it." The first few days were a blur of shock and grief. I slept a lot. I spent hours just sitting in the guest room, staring at the wall, trying to untangle the knot of anger and hurt in my chest. Grandma Evelyn gave me space, but she was always there with a cup of tea or a plate of food, her presence a quiet, steady anchor. I contacted my clients, giving them a vague but professional update that I was moving my office and that there would be no disruption to their projects. They didn't need to know the humiliating details. It was during a quiet evening, about a week after I'd arrived, that the discovery began. We were sitting in her living room, and I was trying to make sense of the sheer venom in my mother's attack. "I just don't understand how it got so bad," I said, shaking my head. "The money stuff with Mark, yeah, but this was something else." Grandma Evelyn set down her knitting and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Clara, your mother and Mark are in serious trouble, and it's trouble they made for themselves." She proceeded to tell me things I never knew. She told me about the second mortgage they'd taken out on the house 6 months prior. They had told her it was for a major kitchen and bathroom renovation. She'd been over to their house several times since. Not a single tile had been changed. The kitchen was exactly the same. "So where did the money go?" I asked, confused. "I have my suspicions," she said, her lips pursed. "Your mother has always had expensive taste, and Mark likes to play the big shot. He talks a big game about stocks and investments. I think he gambled it away on some high-risk venture that went sour." Suddenly, 100 little things started to click into place. The hushed, angry phone calls Mark would take in the other room. The designer handbag Sharon had bought herself for her birthday, an extravagance that seemed insane if they were truly struggling. Their weekend trip to a fancy resort on a deal a couple of months back. They weren't just struggling, they were living a lie, funding a lifestyle they couldn't afford with borrowed money. The most chilling realization came when I remembered something from the year before. My mother had sat me down and pitched a guaranteed real estate flip opportunity, asking if I wanted to invest $5,000 from my savings. At the time, I'd politely declined, a gut feeling telling me it was a bad idea. I now understood it wasn't an investment opportunity. It was a desperate cash grab. They had been trying to get money from me even then. My $500 monthly rent. It wasn't just pocket money for them. It wasn't just covering my water usage. It was a crucial, predictable piece of income they had come to depend on to service their spiraling debt. They hadn't just kicked me out in a fit of rage. Their financial desperation had been building for months, maybe years. The fight wasn't the cause, it was the excuse. They needed to get me out so they could rent my room to a stranger for its full market value, probably double or triple what I was paying. The cruelty, the humiliation, the name-calling, it was all a tactic. It was a tool to make me leave quickly and feel so ashamed that I would never think to question their motives or ask for my deposit back. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was calculated. They had made me the villain in a story they wrote to hide their own catastrophic failures. I wasn't a leech. I was a casualty of their pride. And that discovery changed everything. The anger, when it finally replaced the hurt, was a clean, cold fire. It wasn't the hot, impulsive rage my mother had displayed. It was a focused, quiet fury that demanded answers, not just for my own peace of mind, but for a sense of justice. They had painted me as a failure to hide the fact that they were the ones drowning. I needed to know the full truth, not to confront them, but to arm myself against any future attempts they might make to rewrite history. My grandmother, Evelyn, with her librarian's mind for research and order, became my silent co-conspirator. The investigation began not with snooping, but with public records. It was surprisingly easy. A few searches on the county assessor's website confirmed everything Evelyn had suspected. There it was, in black and white. A second mortgage on my mother's property, filed 8 months ago, for a substantial amount. The lender was a high-interest finance company, not a traditional bank, a clear sign of desperation. This one piece of data recontextualized years of their behavior. It explained the constant pressure on me to get a real job with a stable income. They were projecting their own financial instability onto me. It explained their obsession with appearances, the new car for Mark and the designer bags for Sharon. They were trying to maintain the illusion of success for their friends and neighbors, while their financial world was collapsing inward. With this confirmation, I started to piece together a more detailed timeline. I dug through old emails and text messages, looking for clues I had missed. I found the messages from a year ago where my mother had tried to coax me into the real estate investment. Reading them now, the language was so obviously manipulative. "It's a sure thing, Clara. We could all make a nice profit. It's a way for you to really start building wealth." It was a lie, a clumsy attempt to use my own savings to plug a hole in their sinking ship. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. My cousin, Olivia, who was closer to Mark's side of the family, called me to see how I was doing. She had heard a sanitized version of the story from her parents, that I had decided to move out to be more independent. I didn't correct her with the ugly details, but I did steer the conversation carefully. "Yeah, things were just getting a little tense at home," I said casually. "How are Uncle Mark and Aunt Sharon doing? The last I saw them, they were getting ready for a trip." "Oh yeah, that weekend at the Vineyard Resort," Olivia said. "They posted so many pictures. It looked amazing. Dad said Mark got a big bonus at work and they were celebrating." A big bonus? I knew for a fact that was a lie. Mark had lost his biggest commission right before that trip, so the trip wasn't a celebration, it was an escape, funded by the last of their borrowed money. They were literally fiddling while their Rome burned. The investigation wasn't just about finances, it was about intent. I needed to understand if they felt any remorse. I unblocked my mother's number on my phone for a day just to see if there was any outreach. There was nothing, not a single text, no missed calls. In the weeks following the most traumatic day of my life, the day they made their own daughter homeless, they hadn't reached out once. That silence was more damning than any angry voicemail could have been. It confirmed that my departure was not a regrettable incident. It was a successful operation. The final, sickening piece fell into place a month after I'd moved in with my grandmother. She was on the phone with a friend of hers, a woman who lived 2 streets over from my mother's house. I was in the other room, but could overhear parts of the conversation. "Oh, you'll never guess," her friend said, her voice gossipy. "Sharon and Mark finally got a tenant for their spare room, a nice young man, a nurse at the hospital. I bet they're getting a pretty penny for that room. It's a great location." My blood ran cold. A tenant, so soon? It proved my theory beyond any doubt. The fight wasn't random. The timing wasn't a coincidence. They had likely been planning to rent the room for weeks, just waiting for an excuse to get me out. They probably already had the new tenant lined up. The olive oil was just the convenient match they used to light the fuse. I felt a wave of nausea. They hadn't just kicked me out. They had replaced me. They had looked at their daughter, the one who paid them rent and tried to stay out of their way, and decided that a stranger paying a few $100s more a month was a better deal. I didn't need to investigate any further. I had the complete, ugly picture. They were frauds, living a life of financial deceit, and they had been willing to sacrifice their own child to maintain the facade. The knowledge was horrifying, but it was also liberating. It severed the last lingering threads of guilt or self-doubt I might have had. My pain was no longer just about a family argument, it was about a deep, calculated betrayal. And my desire for justice transformed into a quiet, steely resolve. I wouldn't seek revenge by attacking them. I would build a life so successful, so stable, and so happy that their version of me as a pathetic leech would become an absurd and pathetic lie to anyone who heard it. My success would be my rebuttal. With the full, ugly truth laid bare, the grief that had been my constant companion finally receded, replaced by a powerful, motivating clarity. Revenge, I decided, wasn't about tearing them down. It was about building myself up so high that they could no longer reach me. It was about crafting a life that would serve as a silent, irrefutable counter-narrative to the one they had created. My plan wasn't about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. It was a quiet, methodical strategy of success. I broke it down into phases, approaching my own life like a project for a high-value client. My grandmother, Evelyn, with her unwavering support, became my silent partner and board of directors. Phase 1, fortification. My immediate priority was to establish a rock-solid foundation, both professionally and financially. Living with my grandmother gave me the invaluable gift of stability. I no longer had to walk on eggshells or brace for the next peak. A passive-aggressive comment. All the mental energy I had spent on surviving my home environment could now be funneled directly into my work. I treated my guest room-turned office like a command center. My days became structured and disciplined. I was at my desk by 8 a.m., breaking only for lunch, and often working late into the evening. I poured everything into my business. I used a portion of the money from the bakery project to hire a web developer to build me a sleek, professional website that showcased my portfolio in the best possible light. I invested in advanced design software and subscribed to industry journals. I was no longer just a freelancer. I was the CEO of Clara Designs. I started acting like it. I networked relentlessly on professional platforms, reaching out to marketing managers, small business owners, and tech startups. I offered my services with a newfound confidence, backed by a portfolio that was growing stronger with each completed project. Phase 2, expansion and growth. The hard work began to pay off faster than I could have imagined. About 2 months after the incident, I landed the biggest client of my career, a promising tech startup that needed a complete branding overhaul. They wanted everything: a new logo, a style guide, web assets, social media templates, and marketing materials for an upcoming product launch. The contract was massive, with a payout that was more than my entire previous year's income. It was a grueling, high-pressure project, but I thrived on it. For 6 intense weeks, I was completely immersed. I collaborated with their marketing team, pitched ideas to their executives, and delivered every single asset on time and above their expectations. They were thrilled. The project lead even sent an email to my grandmother's address, the only one I had on my official invoices, praising my professionalism and talent. Grandma Evelyn printed it out and framed it for me. With the first major payment from that contract, I moved to the most critical part of this phase: aggressive financial planning. I met with a financial advisor, a service I never would have dreamed of affording before. Following their advice, I opened a high-yield savings account for my emergency fund, a SEP IRA for my retirement, and a separate business account to keep my finances clean. I created spreadsheets to track my income, expenses, and savings goals. Every dollar had a purpose. I was building a fortress of financial independence, brick by brick. Phase 3, the narrative offensive. This was the most subtle and, in my opinion, the most satisfying part of the plan. I knew my mother. Even if she wasn't speaking to me, she would be watching me. Social media was her window into the lives of others, a tool for judgment and comparison. So I decided to give her a show. I didn't post anything vindictive or overtly boastful. That would be too obvious, too much like her own dramatic behavior. Instead, my strategy was one of quiet, undeniable professionalism. I posted about my work. A sneak peek of a logo concept, carefully blurred to protect client confidentiality. A post celebrating the launch of the tech startup's new website, with a link to their page showcasing my design. So proud to have partnered with the incredible team at Company Name on their rebranding. Exciting things to come, I wrote. Every post was a carefully placed stone in the new foundation of my identity. I was no longer Clara, the girl in her childhood bedroom. I was Clara, the sought-after graphic designer collaborating with innovative companies. 3 months into my new life, I had saved enough for a security deposit and first month's rent on my own apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom in a clean, quiet building in a neighboring town, but it was all mine. The day I signed the lease was one of the proudest moments of my life. I furnished it slowly. With second-hand pieces I refinished myself and a few new items I'd carefully budgeted for. My first post from the new apartment was a picture of my new, dedicated home office. It was a simple shot: a sleek desk, my powerful computer, a new ergonomic chair, and a large window with a nice view. New headquarters for Clara Designs is officially open for business, the caption read, feeling so grateful and excited for this next chapter. I knew that photo would be like a dagger to my mother. Not because it was fancy, but because it was real. It was proof of a success she had declared impossible. It was a direct contradiction to the Leech narrative. Leeches don't sign leases. Leeches don't build headquarters. My quiet, steady progress was a direct assault on their lies, and I never had to say a single word to them. The plan was working perfectly. I was building a life they couldn't touch, couldn't criticize, and couldn't take credit for. I was free. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was only a matter of time before they would come knocking. The 6-month mark passed. By then my life had settled into a rhythm that was entirely my own. My business was not just stable, it was thriving. I had signed 2 more long-term retainer clients, which meant I had a predictable monthly income that far exceeded what I'd ever thought possible. My apartment felt like a home, a sanctuary that I had earned. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been the background noise of my life for years had vanished, replaced by a calm confidence. I was happy. Genuinely, peacefully happy. That was, of course, when the messages started. The first was a text from my mother, a single word, "Hi." I stared at it for a long moment, my heart giving a single, hard thump against my ribs. I felt a flicker of the old fear, the conditioned response to her presence in my life. I took a deep breath, remembered the plan, and deleted the message without responding. A few days later, another text arrived. "Hope you're doing okay?" Again, I deleted it. Silence was my most powerful tool. It denied them the engagement they were seeking. It forced them to sit with their own actions. But they were nothing if not persistent. The messages began to escalate in frequency and tone. "Clara, please answer. Your grandmother says you're okay, but I need to hear it from you." Followed by, "Mark and I miss having you around." I almost laughed at that one. They missed the rent money, not me. Then, as I knew it would, the guilt tripping began. "I can't believe you're shutting me out like this. After everything I've done for you, what did I do to deserve such a cruel daughter?" The lack of self-awareness was staggering. The trickle became a flood. In the space of 1 week, I received over 70 notifications from them. Texts, missed calls that went to a voicemail box I never checked, and a barrage of messages on social media. Their desperation was bleeding through the screen. They were no longer trying to feign casual concern, they were panicking. "Clara, the tenant we had left without notice. The agency says it could take weeks to find someone new. Mark is having trouble at work. They're talking about layoffs. We're behind on the mortgage. Please, we need to talk." Their carefully constructed world was collapsing, and they were reaching for the support beam they had so carelessly kicked out months before. The final message was a direct plea. "Can we please see you? We need to talk. We'll meet anywhere you want." I considered ignoring it, but I realized this was the final step of my plan. Not for their sake, but for mine. I needed to close this chapter face-to-face on my own terms. I replied with a short, professional text. "I can meet you at the Daily Grind coffee shop tomorrow at 2 p.m. I have 30 minutes. The next day, I walked into the coffee shop feeling strangely calm. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a sharp blazer, dark jeans, and professional-looking boots. It was my armor. I saw them sitting at a small table in the corner, and I was struck by how much they had changed. They looked older, smaller, and worn down. The stress they had inflicted on me was now written all over their faces. I sat down without a greeting. My mother immediately launched into a rambling, weak apology. "Clara, I am so sorry about what happened," she began, wringing her hands. "I was under so much stress. I wasn't myself that day. I never should have said those things." Mark nodded vigorously beside her, his face a mask of practiced solemnity. We were in a bad place. We made a terrible mistake." I let them finish, taking a slow sip of the coffee I'd bought myself. I refused to let them control the narrative, to paint this as a simple, stress-induced mistake. When they were done, I placed my cup down and looked them both directly in the eye. "I'm not here to talk about your stress," I said, my voice even and steady. "Let's be clear about what actually happened. You didn't kick me out because you had a bad day. You kicked me out because you took on a second mortgage you couldn't afford, spent the money on trips and luxuries to keep up appearances, and then decided you needed to rent my room for more money to cover your bad decisions." The color drained from their faces. They stared at me, mouths slightly agape. They were utterly stunned that I knew the specifics. "You called me a leech," I continued, my voice never rising, "to justify making your own daughter homeless. You did it to make me feel so ashamed that I would just disappear and you could get a new tenant in to pay for your financial irresponsibility. The cruelty wasn't an accident. It was a strategy." Sharon's facade crumbled completely. Tears began to stream down her face. How did you know?" she stammered. "It doesn't matter how I know," I said. "It's the truth, and now you're in trouble again and you need my help." That's when the real plea came. "Please, Clara," she begged, her voice a desperate whisper. "We're going to lose house, if you could just come home for a little while. You wouldn't have to pay any rent. We just need some help to get back on our feet." The offer was so absurd, so insulting, that all I could do was give a small, sad shake of my head. They still didn't get it. They still saw me as a resource to be used. "No," I said, the single word landing with absolute finality. I stood up from the table, my 30 minutes almost up. "The home you're offering me was never a home. It was a house where I was tolerated as long as I was convenient. I have my own home now." I reached into my purse and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it on the table to cover their coffees. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. It was a final transaction. "I wish you the best of luck in sorting out your finances," I said, looking from my weeping mother to my stunned stepfather. "Goodbye." And with that, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving them and their collapsed world behind me. I didn't look back. Walking out of that coffee shop felt like stepping out of a pressurized cabin into the open air. There was no triumphant fist pump, no surge of vengeful glee. Instead, a profound, quiet peace settled over me. The final confrontation hadn't been about winning an argument. It had been about speaking the truth and closing a door that I had, for too long, left cracked open in the faint, foolish hope that the people on the other side might change. Now I knew they wouldn't, and that knowledge was its own form of freedom. The first thing I did was call my grandmother. I sat in my car in the coffee shop parking lot and told her everything that had happened: their haggard appearance, their flimsy apology, their desperate plea, and my final, calm refusal. "Oh, Clara," she said, and I could hear the pride swelling in her voice. "You did the right thing. You stood in your own strength and your own truth. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you've become." Her validation was the only approval I had ever truly needed. As I had predicted, my refusal to be their financial safety net had consequences. The desperate messages stopped abruptly after our meeting. I blocked both of their numbers, not out of anger, but for my own peace. It was an act of hygiene, like cleaning out a space that had once been cluttered and toxic. The silence that followed was a balm. A few months later, I got an update from Grandma Evelyn, who still heard things through the neighborhood grapevine. True to their word, they couldn't keep up with their debts. They had been forced to sell the house, my childhood home. They didn't make a profit. After paying off the 2 mortgages and the realtor fees, they likely walked away with very little. They moved into a small, 2-bedroom rental apartment in a less desirable part of town. Mark, I heard, had been laid off and was now working at a budget car lot on the highway. Sharon, unable to make a living in the competitive real estate market without the facade of success, had taken a job as a part-time hostess at a family restaurant. Hearing this news didn't bring me joy. It just brought a sense of grim, inevitable finality. They hadn't been brought down by me, they had been brought down by the weight of their own choices. Their pride, their deceit, and their refusal to live within their means had created a house of cards, and it had finally, inevitably, collapsed. I was just the first card they had tried to pull out to keep it standing. My only act was to refuse to be used. My life, in contrast, continued its steady, upward trajectory. My business grew to the point where I was turning down projects. 6 months after the confrontation, I hired my first part-time employee, a bright young design student, to help me with my workload. The day I sent her the first payment for her work, I felt a deep sense of cyclical grace. I was now in a position to give someone else the kind of opportunity and respect I had been denied. My apartment is my sanctuary. It's filled with plants, books, and art that I love. On my wall, there is a simple, elegant frame around the printed-out email from that first tech client, right next to a smiling photo of me and Grandma Evelyn, taken on her 77th birthday. They are my touchstones, reminders of genuine support and earned success. Sometimes, I think about the concept of forgiveness. For a long time, I thought it meant letting my mother and stepfather back into my life, accepting their apologies, and pretending things could go back to the way they were. I now know that's not what forgiveness is for me. Forgiveness was about accepting the truth of who they are and letting go of the hope that they would ever be the parents I needed them to be. Forgiveness was giving myself permission to build a happy, successful life without them in it. Their story is one of decline, of reaping what they sowed. My story is one of growth. I didn't get revenge by destroying them, their own actions took care of that. My victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was the quiet, undeniable hum of a life well lived, a business well run, and a peace of mind well earned. The silence from them is no longer an absence. It is my peace, and it is priceless.